They mocked her for raising a dying child. But years later, that same child returned with power, wealth, and a story that shook the world. This is the heartbreaking journey of a poor woman who took in a dying girl, and the shocking woman that girl became. The sound of hospital machines beeping. A frail black woman lies unconscious, her hands rough from years of hard labor. At her side, a young girl weeps silently, clutching her mother's worn fingers, whispering, "Please, Mom, don't leave me. I'll make it. I promise." Before we go into the full story, tell us which country you are watching from and hit the subscribe button so you will not miss our subsequent heartwarming stories. Sometimes, the smallest decisions we make change the whole direction of our lives. It's not the big, fancy choices, but the ones made in a split second, out of pure, gut-wrenching human feeling. This is where our story begins, on a street that was too quiet for its own good, in a simple neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business, whether they liked it or not. Our main person is a woman named Hannah. Now, when we talk about Hannah, you have to picture someone whose face held the story of 1,000 sunrises and a few hard nights. She was a black woman with a strength you could practically feel radiating off her, but she carried herself with a tired kind of grace. She wasn't rich. In fact, she was as far from it as you could get without being homeless. Her clothes were always clean, but always faded. Her hands, though, were the most important part. They were the hands of a worker, rough and used to the weight of worry. Hannah lived in a tiny apartment above a corner store. She worked 2 cleaning jobs just to keep the lights on and the small fridge running. Her life was simple, hard, and mostly lonely. She didn't have much, but she had her routine, and in a world that often felt chaotic, that routine was a little piece of heaven. One Tuesday, Hannah was walking home after her second shift. The street was the kind that had seen better days, with cracked sidewalks and porch lights that stayed burnt out for months. She wasn't looking for anything unusual. She was just looking forward to a warm glass of water and 5 hours of sleep. Then she saw it. It wasn't big, and it wasn't loud. It was just a bundle, tucked right against the low brick wall of an abandoned lot. Most people walked past it. They probably saw it as trash, or maybe they just saw trouble, and no one wanted trouble on their walk home. But Hannah, maybe because her heart was tired and open, couldn't ignore the odd, unnaturally still quality of that bundle. She stopped, her sensible walking shoes planted firmly on the cracked pavement. She took one hesitant step toward it, then another. As she got closer, her blood ran cold. It wasn't trash. It was a blanket, and inside that blanket, tucked up tight against the cold wall, was a baby. The child was tiny, unbelievably small, and she was white, her skin looking almost translucent and paper-thin beneath the folds of the worn cloth. She was weak, barely clinging to life. Her lips were blue, and her breathing was so shallow that Hannah had to strain to hear it. This wasn't just a found baby. This was a dying baby. Abandoned, left like something disposable. A knot of absolute despair tightened in Hannah's chest. She dropped her worn handbag, the one with the faded daisies, right there on the sidewalk. She didn't look left or right. She bent down, her strong, calloused hands shaking. She scooped the small, cold weight of the infant into her arms. The baby made no sound. Just holding her, Hannah felt the fragile life slipping away. And right there, on that lonely roadside, the tears came. They weren't just tears for the baby. They were tears for every injustice, every lonely person, and every forgotten struggle in the world. She held the small girl tight against her own chest, trying to transfer her own body heat, her own life force, into the tiny, freezing body. Hannah didn't go to the hospital right away. She knew if she called the authorities, the child would go into the system, and maybe that was the right thing. But something primal, something deep in her soul, told her this child needed her, not paperwork. She ran a few blocks back to her tiny apartment. The first person to spot her was Mrs. Pearl, who sat on her porch swing every evening like a neighborhood watch queen. Mrs. Pearl's eyes widened to saucers. "Anna, what is that? Whose baby is that?" Mrs. Pearl called out, her voice sharp with judgment. Hannah just clutched the baby tighter and kept walking, trying to hurry past. But Mrs. Pearl got up and followed her to the steps. "You hear me, girl? You can't just pick up a child. You can't even feed yourself properly. Are you crazy? You can't afford a sick dog, much less an unknown child." That sentiment was echoed a moment later by Mr. Dennis, the landlord's son, who was fiddling with his truck across the street. He laughed, a bitter, mean sound that scraped against Hannah's ears. "Yeah, Hannah, what are you going to do? Feed her sunshine and dust?" The mockery, the sharp, cold judgment from the people who saw her poverty and not her heart, stung worse than the cold street air. They saw the impossible challenge. They saw the financial ruin. They saw the difference in color, the dark-skinned, struggling woman holding the pale, dying child, and they saw a scandal waiting to happen. Hannah finally reached her apartment door. She turned, her face wet with tears, but her eyes burning with a fierce light. She didn't shout. She didn't explain. She looked down at the infant in her arms, who gave the faintest, most pathetic whimper. Hannah knew what she was doing. This wasn't a choice, it was a calling. She whispered one single sentence, directed not at the neighbors, but whispered tenderly into the ear of the infant, promising her whole heart, "From now on, you're mine." And with that, she went inside and locked the world out. Inside the tiny, warm room, Hannah moved fast. She boiled water, found the cleanest, softest towel she owned, and gently stripped the baby. The child was worse than she thought. Bony, unresponsive, clearly malnourished and fighting an infection. She wrapped her tightly and placed her near the sputtering radiator. She had no baby clothes, no formula. All she had was love and desperation. She boiled a little sugar water, the old-fashioned remedy her grandmother swore by, and carefully dripped a few drops onto the baby's lips. The baby weakly swallowed. Hours passed in a terrifying silence. Hannah sat bolt upright on her worn sofa, the baby tucked safely in the crook of her arm, breathing against her neck. She whispered to the child constantly, telling her about the sun, about the ocean, about how she was going to be loved, even if the world had thrown her away. "You need a name," Hannah murmured, stroking the tiny forehead. She looked at the child, so delicate, so fragile and yet, somehow, still hey. "You are small, but you are strong. Your name is Ella. You will always be my light." Hannah prayed like she had never prayed before, not just for the baby, but for the strength to be the mother this girl deserved. She didn't know how she would feed her, clothe her, or pay for medicine. All she knew was that she wouldn't let go. The darkest hour is always just before dawn, and that night was the darkest Hannah had ever known. She felt every single minute drag by, watching Ella for any change, terrified of the moment her small, struggling breath might stop. But love, stubborn and fierce, has a way of refusing to quit. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the single window of the apartment, something miraculous happened. Ella stirred. Her tiny eyelids fluttered open, and she let out a small, weak cry. It wasn't the sound of pain, but the sound of need. It was a sound that proved she had made it through the night. Hannah didn't just smile. She shattered with relief. Tears streamed down her face again, but this time, they were pure joy. She pressed her cheek to Ella's head, feeling the faint, welcome warmth. She didn't have money, or a supportive community, or even a plan, but she had something better, a reason to fight. She had this tiny, vulnerable soul who had been rejected by the world, but accepted by her. In that small, quiet, sun-drenched moment, poverty, mockery, and struggle retreated into the shadows. Only love remained. The baby girl, Ella, had survived. And Hannah, the poor woman who dared to love the unlovable, had just become a mother. When Hannah carried tiny Ella out of her apartment that first morning, she wasn't just walking to the local clinic. She was walking into a war against the odds, against poverty, and against a body that was shutting down. She held the baby so tightly, wrapping her in her own sweater, praying the warmth of her own skin would be enough to hold the life inside. At the community clinic, the atmosphere was busy and stressed, full of worried parents and tired nurses. But the moment the triage nurse saw Ella, so pale, so still, They were rushed back. A young doctor, sharp-eyed but weary, examined the child. He didn't mince words. He was professional, but his voice was heavy with the weight of experience. He told Hannah exactly what she dreaded. "Hannah," he said, looking at her with a gentle sadness, "this baby is severely malnourished. We call it failure to thrive. She was exposed to the cold for too long, and her immune system is non-existent. I have to be honest with you. We will do everything we can, but you need to prepare yourself. Statistically, this child is not expected to live long." That phrase, "not expected to live long," hit Hannah like a physical blow. It was the world officially confirming the death sentence that had been whispered on the cold street side. But the diagnosis didn't break her. Instead, it lit a fire under her soul. Ella was admitted, and for the next few days, Hannah lived in that small, sterile hospital room. She didn't go to work. She couldn't. She sat by the crib, her worn chair squeaking softly whenever she shifted. Her love wasn't loud. It was silent, constant, and fierce. She studied every single drip, every monitor beep, every flicker of Ella's eyelids. A kind nurse named Maria, who had seen hundreds of cases like this, started bringing Hannah extra blankets and cups of tea. Maria noticed something different about Hannah. She didn't cry easily. She fought. "You can go home, Hannah," Nurse Maria told her one night, gently touching her shoulder. "We will call you if anything changes." Hannah shook her head, her eyes glued to Ella. "No, Maria," she said simply. "She knows my voice. I have to be here. She has to know she's not alone anymore." She would lean over the crib and talk to the tiny, unresponsive baby. She told Ella about the world she was fighting for. She described the sun on the pavement, the smell of rain, the taste of her grandmother's coconut bread. She didn't talk about fear. She only talked about life, breathing hope into the sterile air. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things started to shift. The battle was fought in millimeters. The first victory was when Ella's breathing, which had been dangerously shallow and ragged, began to find a rhythm. It wasn't deep, but it was steady. Hannah noticed it first, that subtle, gentle rise and fall of the small chest. She didn't shout. She just laid her hand over the baby's heart and cried tears of quiet gratitude. Then came the color. The terrifying, translucent paleness of Ella's skin started to warm, taking on a soft, faint pink hue. It was the color of a newborn sunrise, and Hannah watched it like it was the most beautiful painting she had ever seen. One afternoon, Hannah was gently stroking Ella's tiny hand, whispering a lullaby, when she felt it, a minute squeeze. Ella's fingers, which had been limp and cold, curled slightly around Hannah's index finger. It was the slightest movement, but to Hannah, it was an earthquake. It was a sign, a spark of will. The nurses started taking note. "Too. Her vitals are improving, Hannah," the doctor admitted a few days later, sounding genuinely perplexed. "I don't understand it. She shouldn't be rallying this quickly. There is no medical explanation for this kind of turnaround." This was the moment Hannah had been waiting for. She stood taller than she had in years, the conviction in her voice silencing the room. She looked the doctor right in the eye, her own eyes shining. "It's not medicine, doctor," Hannah said, her voice soft but strong. "It's a miracle. This child is meant to live. She is meant for something greater." The world gave up on her, but destiny chose a different path. She wasn't being religious. She was stating a fact of the heart. Her fierce, uncompromising love had somehow reached the child's fading spirit and dragged her back. After 2 agonizing weeks, Ella was finally stable enough to go home. The doctors released her with a long list of follow-up appointments and a warning that she would require constant, specialized care. Hannah didn't care about the logistics. She just cared that she was taking her daughter home, alive. The simple routine of their small apartment became the setting for their healing. Hannah made sure Ella was always warm, always fed, and always held. The neighbors still watched and whispered, but Hannah had mastered the art of ignoring their judgment. Their laughter was weak compared to the incredible power of the life she held in her arms. Then, about a month after the discovery, it happened. Hannah was sitting on the floor of her living room, rocking Ella in her lap. She was rubbing the baby's tummy, making soft, nonsensical noises. Ella looked up at her mother's face, the dark skin, the tired eyes, the loving smile, and her tiny mouth spread wide. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a coo. It was a laugh. A tiny, bubbling sound that was more of a squeak than a full laugh, but it was pure, unadulterated joy. The sound shattered the silence of the room. Hannah froze. Then she threw her head back and laughed herself, a deep, booming, joyous sound that chased away all the months of stress, fear, and struggle. That laugh was the sound of destiny changing its mind. It was the sound of a little girl overcoming every single impossible odd. It was the final, triumphant confirmation that love and will had won the battle. Ella, the abandoned, dying child, was now a small, laughing survivor. Her survival was the first, undeniable sign that her life would not be defined by how she was thrown away, but by the extraordinary life she was meant to build. As Hannah held her daughter, rocking her back and forth, she knew their struggles were far from over, but the most important victory was theirs. They had hope, they had each other, and love, fierce and pure, had found its home. The initial miracle of Ella's survival was followed immediately by the cold, relentless reality of daily life. Love doesn't pay the rent, and hope doesn't fill an empty stomach. Ella was now a small, bright-eyed toddler with a spirit that glowed, but she was a reminder of Hannah's enormous, continuous burden. The years that followed were defined by work. Not the decent, salaried kind of work, but the back-breaking, menial kind. Hannah became a ghost of the morning and a shadow of the night. She scrubbed the sticky floors of a greasy diner before the sun came up. She washed mounds of clothes for families richer than she could ever imagine, her hands raw and chapped from the strong detergents. She carried heavy loads of stock up steep flights of stairs for the small market downtown. It was never-ending. She worked jobs that demanded she be invisible, quiet, quick, and tired, just to bring home a handful of crumbled dollars. Life wasn't just about the work. It was about the math. A few dollars for cheap formula or milk, a few dollars for rent, a few cents for the bus fare. When you have nothing, every purchase is a choice between two essentials, and the choice Hannah made every single time was for Ella. There were so many nights where Hannah's stomach was a tight, painful knot of hunger. She would cook a small pot of rice and beans, and while she watched Ella happily spoon the warm food into her mouth, Hannah would sit opposite her, sipping only a glass of water. "You're not eating, Mom," Ella would ask, her little brow furrowed with concern. Even as a small child, she was perceptive. "Oh, Mom ate already, sweet girl." Hannah would lie smoothly, leaning over to kiss the top of Ella's head. "I ate while I was working. Now, finish up. We need you strong, little warrior." She rationed her own meals to nearly nothing. Her worn-out shoes had holes she covered with tape, and the coat she wore had belonged to her own mother decades ago. Hannah was fading physically, growing thinner and more exhausted, but the light in her eyes for Ella never dimmed. She was sacrificing her own body so Ella could have a chance to grow tall and strong. The neighbors didn't let up. They saw Hannah's deprivation, but instead of pity, they offered only cold ridicule. Mrs. Pearl, still glued to her porch swing, cornered Hannah one afternoon as she struggled up the stairs with a heavy bag of cheap groceries. "Hannah, let me tell you something," Mrs. Pearl sneered, not bothering to lower her voice. "You are a fool. A fool. This little white child, this child who ain't even kin to you, she's dragging you down. You could be saving money. You could be getting a better apartment. Instead, you're starving yourself to feed a stray." Mr. Dennis, leaning against his idling truck, chimed in, "She's right, Hannah. Look at you. You're wearing yourself down to the bone. That girl is going to grow up and forget you ever existed. She's going to move on to her own kind. You're wasting your energy on a lost cause." The words were designed to hurt, to plant seeds of doubt. Most people would have snapped. They would have yelled back, or wept, or maybe even started to wonder if their cruel words held a grain of truth. But Hannah had a secret weapon, dignity. She set the grocery bag down gently, wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, and looked directly at them. There was no anger in her voice, only deep, calm certainty. I am not a fool, Mrs. Pearl, Hannah stated. I'm a mother, and I don't raise Ella hoping she will pay me back. I raise her because she is my child, and as long as she is with me, we have enough. She picked up the heavy bag and walked up the steps, leaving them in stunned silence. She wrapped her daughter in love and dignity, and that was a richer inheritance than any amount of money the neighbors might have had. To Hannah, Ella wasn't a burden. She was the engine that kept her going. When Hannah came home, bone-tired and sore, the door would fly open and a flash of blonde hair and boundless energy would collide with her legs. "Mom, you're home!" Ella would shriek, her small arms wrapping tight around Hannah's waist. That sound, that pure, unadulterated joy, was Hannah's daily medicine. It was better than any meal, any nap, or any lottery win. Ella was a whirlwind of questions, stories, and loud, infectious laughter. She was also a gentle, loving child. She'd run to fetch Hannah's worn-out slippers. She'd rub Hannah's tired hands. She might not have had a fancy life, but she was rich in attention and security. One evening, after putting Ella to bed in their shared, tiny room, Hannah sat at the window, staring out at the distant city lights. Her body ached. The future looked as impossibly hard as the past. She thought about Mrs. Pearl's words, wasting her energy. But then she heard a soft sigh from the bed. Ella was staring in her sleep. Hannah walked over and watched her daughter breathing steadily, peacefully. Ella was alive, vibrant, and whole, and that was Hannah's creation. Ella wasn't just a reason to endure. She was the only reason. She was Hannah's joy, her living, breathing hope. Every scrubbed floor, every aching muscle, every skipped meal was a single brick in the foundation of Ella's future. Hannah wasn't poor. She was investing every ounce of a life force into something infinitely precious. She bent down and kissed Ella's forehead, smoothing her hair. The world offered them scorn, but in this small room, Hannah gave Ella unconditional love. The reality of their material poverty was sharp and unforgiving, but the love that bound them was unbreakable and abundant. Hannah had traded comfort for calling, and as she sat beside her beautiful, miracle child, she realized she had gotten the better end of the deal. She had fought the world's judgment and won. Love and dignity were their daily bread, and with those, they would continue to thrive. For Hannah, sending Ella off to school was like giving her only treasure to the world to be judged. Ella was about 6 years old now, a tangle of sunny, pale blonde hair and leg that seemed too long for her tiny, worn shoes. Hannah had spent weeks trying to make Ella's clothes look new, sewing patches over worn-out knees and scrubbing the one sweater until the wool felt threadbare. On that first morning, Hannah knelt down to tie the laces of Ella's shoes, the ones she'd carefully taped around the sole to cover a persistent hole. "Remember what Mom told you, baby girl," Hannah whispered, adjusting the collar of Ella's hammer-down jacket. "You go there to learn. You are smart, and you are loved, no matter what." When Ella walked through the doors of the neighborhood public school, she didn't walk into a bright place of learning. She walked into a battlefield of cruelty. Kids, as we know, can be brutally honest, and their honesty can be the sharpest knife. They don't see the effort, they only see the difference. Ella's poverty was loud, even though she was quiet. The children immediately found her weaknesses. They zeroed in on the things Hannah had tried so hard to hide. "Look at her shoes. They are squeaking," a boy named Kevin yelled across the playground one day. Ella's face burned hot. The tape Hannah had used was coming undone, and the worn rubber made a pathetic, wet sound when she walked on the asphalt. "Is that your grandpa's jacket?" a girl named Chloe asked, pointing at the oversized, patched sleeve. "It smells like old soap and dust." Ella couldn't fight back. She didn't know how. Hannah had taught her dignity, and dignity didn't include shouting insults. So, Ella learned to be silent. She kept her head down, her back straight, and her silence became her shield. She ate her lunch, usually just a cheap sandwich or piece of fruit, alone in the far corner of the playground. The other kids laughed and played in their bright, new clothes, and Ella learned to disappear. The cruelty didn't just come from the children. Sometimes it came from the adults, too. They didn't mean to be cruel, but their exhaustion and their assumptions created walls just as high. Ella's third-grade teacher was Ms. Patel. Ms. Patel was experienced, but she was overworked and cynical. When she looked at Ella, she didn't see a miracle child. She saw the file notes: father unknown, single mother, poverty indicator high. She saw Ella's quietness and her inability to buy the required supplies, and she made a swift, incorrect judgment. She's too far behind, Ms. Patel thought. She probably won't keep up. Just keep her quiet and safe until the bell rings. When Ella didn't raise her hand, because she was afraid of saying the wrong thing and inviting more ridicule, Ms. Patel assumed she didn't know the answer. When Ella didn't join the loud group projects, the teacher assumed she lacked basic social skills. Ella was often seated at the back, given simpler tasks, and largely ignored. She was put in the remedial reading group, even though she was spending her evenings reading old, donated library books, devouring every page. They judged her by the holes in her shoes, not the depth of her mind. But beneath Ella's silence, beneath the layer of humiliation, burned a mind that was sharp as a diamond. That time in the hospital, fighting for her life, had instilled in Ella a fierce will to survive, and in her small, cramped home, Hannah's constant love had given her a quiet confidence in her own value. Because she wasn't talking, Ella was listening. She remembered everything the teacher said. She absorbed the flow of numbers, the patterns of history, the rules of grammar. She didn't have toys or television to distract her, so her focus was absolute. One day, the class was working on a complicated math problem involving fractions, something that was supposed to take the rest of the week. Ella was working on a tattered notebook she'd found. Ms. Patel had explained the standard textbook method, a slow, multi-step process. But Ella found a better way. She saw the logic in the numbers and invented a clever solution that cut out half the steps. Later that week, while Ms. Patel was frustratedly re-explaining the problem, she walked past Ella's desk and glanced down. She saw the girl's tiny, careful handwriting and paused. Ella hadn't just solved the problem. She had solved it elegantly. "Ella," Ms. Patel said, her voice sounding louder than usual. "How did you get from line 2 to line 4? Ella looked up, startled by the attention. In her quiet, clear voice, she explained her alternate, more logical path. The whole classroom was silent. Ms. Patel stayed at the board, then at the notebook, then back at Ella. It was completely correct. It was brilliant. That day, the atmosphere shifted. Ms. Patel couldn't dismiss Ella anymore. She started watching her. She stopped asking her the easy questions and began asking the complicated ones, the ones that required thinking, not just memory. Ella consistently delivered. She could recite complex historical timelines. She could correct a grammatical error on the blackboard that Ms. Patel had missed. She was not just keeping up. She was excelling, quietly and consistently, proving every single assumption wrong. Her resilience, born from the sheer will to survive and thrive for Hannah, was unbreakable. The change in the teacher's perception was a sweet, silent victory. Ms. Patel realized her judgment had been based on clothing and poverty, not on ability. When Hannah came to the school for a rare meeting, having taken an hour off from scrubbing floors, she looked worried and tired. She was ready to hear about low grades and poor behavior. Instead, Ms. Patel looked at Hannah, her eyes wide with a respect she hadn't had before. "Mrs. Hannah," she said gently, "Ella is a gift. She is the brightest student I have had in 5 years. Her mind is incredible." Hannah, who was used to scorn and mockery, felt her knees weaken. Her eyes welled up with happy tears. She didn't hear the word brightest. She heard the word gift. She went home that night and held Ella tight, rocking her in the dark. The kids still mocked the shoes, and the teachers still struggled to understand her silence. But the seeds had been planted. Ella's brilliance was slowly but surely shining through the shadows of humiliation. Her mind was her inheritance, and no amount of poverty or scorn could take it away. Justice hadn't just been served. It was being earned, one clever solution at a time. The world thought she was a lost cause, but Ella was proving she was meant for something truly great. Years passed quickly, marked not by birthdays or holidays, but by school terms and Hannah's sheer exhaustion. Ella was now around 11 years old, not a baby anymore, but a bright, self-aware young lady. Her success in school, her sharp mind, and her surprising resilience had become the talk of the small neighborhood, silencing some of the old ridicule. But success, Hannah quickly learned, comes with a price tag. The most stressful time of the year wasn't Christmas, it was exam season. Ella was excelling, placed in advanced classes where the expectations and the required materials were sky high. She came home one day with a long, typed list detailing what she needed for the upcoming state exams. A specific set of textbooks, a required calculator that cost a small fortune, a new, mandatory uniform for exam day, and special art supplies. Hannah sat down at the kitchen table, reading the list over and over, feeling the blood drain from her face. It wasn't just expensive, it was impossible. Her latest floor-scrubbing gig had barely covered the overdue light bill. There was literally nothing left. She had nothing to sell, nothing to pawn, and no one to borrow from. In her small, shared bedroom, tucked into a velvet box that had once been much fancier, sat Hannah's only remaining treasure, a small gold locket. It wasn't flashy or valuable to a jeweler, but to Hannah, it was priceless. It had belonged to her grandmother, who had worn it through the toughest times, and had passed it down to Hannah on her 18th birthday. It was thin, slightly tarnished, and etched with a simple floral pattern, holding the faint scent of old rosewater. It was more than jewelry. It was a tangible link to her family's history, her lineage, and the memory of strength passed down through generations. She had held on to it through starvation, through sickness, and through eviction threats. She always told herself, "I will never let this go. This is my last anchor." Now, staring at the list of Ella's exam materials, Hannah knew what she had to do. Ella's future mattered more than any piece of gold or memory. She couldn't allow her daughter's brilliance to be dimmed by the lack of a required textbook. Hannah waited until Ella was sound asleep. She took the locket, tucking it deep into her worn coat pocket. She found a small, discreet jewelry buyer 5 bus stops away, a place where no one from her neighborhood would recognize her. The transaction was cold, quick, and heartbreaking. The buyer barely glanced at the locket. "It's a low carat," he muttered, pushing a small stack of bills across the counter. The money was a pittance, less than half of what the locket meant to Hannah. Hannah didn't argue. She simply nodded, took the money, and walked out without looking back at the counter where her history lay abandoned. The physical act of selling the locket was like tearing a piece of her soul away, but the pain was instantly overwhelmed by the fierce determination that fueled her. "This is for Ella," she repeated in her mind. "This is everything." The next day, Hannah came home from work earlier than usual. She was tired, but she carried a precious, heavy bag. She had bought everything on the list. She laid the items out on the small kitchen table. A set of crisp, new textbooks that still smelled like the print shop. A shiny, silver scientific calculator. A starched, neatly folded blue uniform that was exactly Ella's size. When Ella saw the supplies, she didn't just smile. She gasped. She ran her hand over the smooth cover of the textbooks, her eyes wide with reverence. "Mom, how did you get all this?" Ella whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She knew exactly how hard up they were. She knew this was a miracle. "Don't you worry about that, sweet girl," Hannah said, trying to sound cheerful while she avoided her daughter's gaze. "I just moved some things around. You focus on your exams. You make me proud." Hannah's heart swelled with the joy of providing for her child, but underneath, a deep, silent sorrow lingered for her lost piece of heritage. She was careful to keep the velvet box hidden and never mention the locket again. She thought the secret was safe. But Ella was an observant girl. She was bright enough to solve complex algebraic equations, and she was certainly bright enough to notice the small, deep rhythms of her mother's life. A few nights later, while Hannah was asleep, Ella tiptoed into the bedroom. She wanted to look at the locket, her mother's most cherished item, just to remind herself that some things lasted forever. She opened the small velvet box tucked away in the drawer. The box was empty. A chill ran down Ella's spine, a chill far colder than any she had felt on the abandoned roadside years ago. She didn't need to ask. She didn't need an explanation. She knew instantly that the locket had paid for her school supplies. The textbooks she revered, the calculator she needed, they had come at the cost of her mother's heart. The next morning, Ella waited for Hannah to wake up. She didn't confront her with accusation or pity. She simply sat by the bedside, waiting. When Hannah opened her eyes, she saw Ella looking at her, her expression solemn and fiercely determined. Ella gently reached out, taking her mother's rough, work-worn hands that had scrubbed floors, washed clothes, and now sold history, into her own small, clean ones. "Mom," Ella said, her voice low but steady, filled with the weight of a powerful promise. She didn't mention the locket. She didn't need to. She looked directly into Hannah's tired eyes, and with an undeniable force of will, she delivered a vow that changed everything. "One day, Mom, I'll repay you. Everything you've done will not be in vain." It wasn't a promise made lightly. It was a sacred oath. It was justice taking root in the heart of a young girl. Hannah's eyes filled with tears, not of pain, but of profound love and gratitude. She knew, in that moment, that the sacrifice had been worth far more than the gold. She had bought her daughter's future, and Ella had promised to make it beautiful. Love had won the price of admission to a better life. Ella was 14 now, in high school, and she carried the weight of her promise to Hannah like a precious stone. The expensive textbooks, the shiny calculator, they weren't just school supplies. They were a debt of love, paid for with her mother's history. That quiet vow she made had turned her relentless study habits into an absolute mission. She wasn't just smart anymore. She was driven. She knew that to truly repay Hannah, she couldn't just get good grades. She had to achieve a level of success that was impossible for someone from their background. She needed something that transcended the limited opportunities of their neighborhood. She needed a hidden gift. The gift didn't reveal itself in the traditional, creative sense. Ella didn't suddenly pick up a guitar or start painting canvases. Her genius was structural, systematic, and entirely modern. It started in a boring, mandatory high school class, basic computing. While other kids were learning to type or use simple software, Ella found herself captivated by the logic of the systems. The way code worked, the flow of data, and the hidden mechanisms that ran the world's finances and technology. It was a language she understood instinctively. Her fascination deepened when she enrolled in a free after-school club run by a patient, quiet teacher named Mr. Thomas. He introduced the students to the basic concepts of finance, market systems, and a little bit of coding. While everyone else was daydreaming, Ella saw patterns. She saw how tiny adjustments in a financial model could lead to massive outcomes. She saw that technology and business weren't about money. They were about efficiency, systems, and foresight. The same meticulous attention she used to conserve money at home, she now applied to imaginary corporate budgets and stock simulations. A fire lit inside her. It wasn't just ambition. It was pure, intoxicating passion. This was the key. This was the mechanism to build the future she promised Hannah. Since they didn't have a computer at home, and certainly no internet, Ella's relentless practice had to happen elsewhere. Every single day after school, Ella walked straight past her apartment building and headed to the public library. It was a short, 10-minute walk, but it led to a world of endless possibilities. She sat at the sticky, donated computer banks, often until the library closed, trying to soak up everything she could. She didn't waste time on social media or games. She spent hours teaching herself basic programming languages, reading old business journals, and devouring textbooks on economics that were far beyond her grade level. She learned how to build simple websites and how market forces move prices. Hannah noticed her absence, but she never questioned it. She would come home, put Ella's dinner in the small oven to keep warm, and sit by the window waiting. When Ella finally came home, smelling faintly of old books and public library air, her eyes were bright, and she wasn't tired. She was energized. "What are you doing over there so late, Ella?" Hannah asked one night, gently rubbing Ella's neck. Ella just smiled, a hint of steel in her eyes. "I'm learning how to build things, Mom. Things that matter." Of course, the intense focus did not go unnoticed by the people who still loved to judge. The scorn didn't stop, it just changed targets. "Look at that little girl," Mrs. Pearl muttered to her neighbor on the street corner. "Sitting on those old library computers every night. What's she doing? Playing a game." Another neighbor, Mr. Henderson scoffed. She's reading about fancy stocks and business. Please, that's for people who start with money. A poor girl from this street could never make it in those big finance buildings. She's wasting her time on fantasies. Her peers were just as bad. They saw her sitting alone, always studying, always focused. Why don't you ever come out, Ella? Are you trying to be a genius or something? They teased. You think some old book is going to get you out of this neighborhood? The doubt was loud. It was constant. They tried to hold her back with their low expectations, trying to convince her that she was only allowed to dream dreams that matched her worn-out shoes. They saw her background as a permanent label, not a starting point. But there was one person who saw past the quiet girl with the patched clothes, Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas was the kind of teacher who didn't grade you on what you knew, but on how you thought. He noticed the speed with which Ella grasped complex concepts. He saw her passion wasn't just about grades. It was about an inner hunger to understand and control systems. One afternoon, Ella was struggling with a complex spreadsheet model, trying to figure out how to forecast growth for an imaginary tech company. She felt frustrated, the doubt of her neighbors creeping into her mind. Mr. Thomas walked over, watching her fingers fly across the keys with instinctive precision. He didn't offer to fix the spreadsheet. Instead, he simply pulled up a chair. Ella, he said, his voice low and serious. The other kids, they are learning the rules. You are learning to change them. They look at your hands and see a girl working on an old computer. I look at your hands and see a future CEO. Ella looked up, her blue eyes wide with surprise. She wasn't used to such high, honest praise. He leaned closer, his voice full of conviction, giving her the gift of belief that she would carry forever. You're going to be more than they can imagine. Don't you ever let anyone, not even the people who think they know your limit, tell you otherwise. Keep working. Your gift is real. Those words, you're going to be more than they can imagine, didn't just stay with Ella. They became the engine of her life. They were the external validation for the internal promise she had made to her mother. When the neighbors scoffed, she heard Mr. Thomas. When she was tired and hungry, she remembered Hannah's sacrifice. She wrapped those words, and her mother's love, around her like armor. She was no longer just a poor girl from the rough part of town. She was a focused, brilliant student with a hidden gift in technology and finance, and a solemn promise to uphold. Her destiny was no longer just about survival. It was about soaring. Ella continued her relentless practice, knowing that her gift was the key to unlocking the freedom and comfort her mother so desperately deserved. Love and genius were teaming up, and the world was about to be surprised by what this young woman could accomplish. As Ella got older, her life became a balancing act. On one side was the intense focus required for her burgeoning success in technology and business. On the other was the simple, heartbreaking reality of her home life with Hannah. She was quiet, smart, and often alone, but in high school, she made a friend. A close friend named Tanya. Tanya was bright and popular, and she seemed genuinely drawn to Ella's quiet genius. Ella, who had always been a solitary figure, treasured the companionship. They shared secrets, and for the first time, Ella let her guard down just a little. She didn't tell Tanya about the locket, but Tanya knew enough to piece together Ella's struggle. She saw the worn thread of Ella's backpack strap and the faded color of a single pair of shoes. But Tanya also saw something else, Ella's brilliance. And that, tragically, became the poison in their friendship. Tanya was smart, but Ella was in a different league, catching the eye of teachers like Mr. Thomas and being fast-tracked for specialized programs. Ella was meticulous about her appearance, thanks to Hannah's lessons in dignity. But there were limits to what soap and effort could fix. Her clothes were always clean, but the material was thin, and the cuffs of her winter jacket were visibly torn and frayed. Her lunch was always the same, something cheap, simple, and filling, often just a meager portion of leftovers or a peanut butter sandwich, while the other kids bought hot cafeteria food. Ella would quickly eat her lunch, usually on her own, pretending to read. She tried to make her poverty invisible, but to a person looking for an advantage, those flaws were clear, open targets. The betrayal came just after Ella won a major coding competition, a local award that guaranteed her a spot in a prestigious summer tech camp. Tanya had also competed and had placed second. The jealousy, hidden for months beneath the guise of friendship, finally broke through. The humiliation happened during lunchtime in the crowded school cafeteria. It was loud, chaotic, and full of judgmental eyes, the perfect stage for a cruel performance. Ella was sitting at a table near the back, quietly eating her sandwich. Tanya walked up to the table, but she wasn't smiling. Her face was hard, laced with a bitter resentment that shocked Ella. "Look at our genius, everyone," Tanya called out, loud enough for the entire corner of the cafeteria to hear. "The girl who's too smart for all of us." Kids at nearby tables stopped talking and looked over. Ella felt her face freeze. Tanya didn't stop there. She leaned in, her voice dripping with scorn, then pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Ella's plate. "But you know what's really funny? She's going to this super fancy camp, but she can't even afford a real meal." "What is that, Ella? Is that just a slice of bread and some sad leftovers?" Then, Tanya reached out and grabbed the sleeve of Ella's old, faithful jacket, pulling it up for everyone to see the worn, ripped fabric. "Look at her. The girl who's going to build the future is wearing clothes that belong in the garbage. She's nothing but ghetto trash." The laughter that erupted from the surrounding tables was cold and sharp. It wasn't the sound of playful teasing. It was the sound of true, crushing scorn. The laughter stung Ella more deeply than any slap. It wasn't just about her torn clothes. It was a loud, public rejection of every single sacrifice Hannah had ever made. The shame wasn't hers alone. It belonged to her mother, too. For the first time since she was a fragile baby, Ella felt completely defenseless, exposed, and crushed. Ella didn't fight. She didn't cry. She just quietly, slowly, picked up her bag and walked out of the cafeteria, the sound of the mocking laughter chasing her all the way to the bus stop. She went home and locked herself in her room, lying down on her simple bed, unable to move. Hannah came home that evening and immediately knew something was terribly wrong. Ella was usually studying, or at least pretending to. Hannah sat down on the edge of the bed and simply placed her hand on Ella's back. "Tell Mom what happened, Ella," Hannah murmured, her voice soft but steady. Ella finally opened up, the tears coming in a torrent as she recounted the sheer cruelty of the betrayal. Hannah listened, her expression darkening with sorrow for her daughter's pain. When Ella was finished, Hannah didn't offer empty words about forgiveness. Instead, she offered the harsh truth that she herself lived every day. "Baby girl," Hannah said, holding her tightly, "Tanya's problem isn't your clothes. Her problem is your light. You will always be a target when you shine brighter than everyone else." That night, Ella cried until there were no tears left. But as the dark hours passed, something inside her began to shift. The crushing pain didn't destroy her. It was chemically transformed into something else, pure, unyielding steel. Ella woke up the next morning with a clarity she'd never had before. She looked in the mirror at her own exhausted face. She realized that the world, the whole outside world, represented by the cold laughter of the cafeteria, would never hand her anything freely. Dignity, opportunity, success, and the ability to repay her mother. She would have to fight for every single bit of it. No one would cheer for her. They would try to trip her. She went to school that day, not with her head down in shame, but with her chin lifted, her silence now a deliberate choice of strength. She had hardened her resolve. She was done feeling sorry for herself, and she was done trusting people whose love was conditional. The betrayal was the final, agonizing lesson she needed. She understood that her life was a battle for dignity, fought against poverty, prejudice, and the petty cruelty of others. And she was absolutely, irrevocably ready to fight. Her heartbroken resolve became the new, indestructible foundation of her future success. Ella was 17, right on the edge of high school graduation, working harder than ever, powered by pure adrenaline and the sacred promise to her mother. The betrayal from her friend had only sharpened her focus, making her even more relentless in her studies and her side jobs. She was building the future brick by painful brick. But while Ella was fighting for their future, her past was finally catching up to the one person she held dear. The years of scrubbing floors, carrying heavy loads, and skipping meals had taken a silent, heavy toll on Hannah's body. She had always dismissed her aches and pains, attributing them to just getting old. But the truth was, her physical strength was dangerously depleted. One rainy evening, Ella came home from the library. She'd been studying late for a massive final exam. The apartment was quiet, the air thick and still. She found Hannah not sitting on the worn sofa, but lying on the floor, right beside it. She had collapsed. Hannah wasn't moving, her skin pale and clammy. The sight struck Ella with a terror colder and deeper than anything she'd ever known. This was the one fear that always hid in the corners of their small life, losing the only person who had ever truly loved her. Panic was a luxury Ella couldn't afford. She snapped into action, the years of quiet resilience taking over. She didn't call Mrs. Pearl for help. She called an ambulance, speaking in a calm, clear voice that surprised even herself. The rush to the public hospital was a blur of flashing lights and terrifying silence. After hours of waiting, a doctor, kind but direct, finally delivered the news. "Ella," the doctor explained gently, "your mother isn't having an acute, sudden event. This is chronic. Her body is just worn out. We see this often with people who have done years of hard, physical labor while struggling with malnutrition. She's suffering from severe exhaustion and general depletion. She needs rest, proper food, and time. If she keeps working like this, she won't recover." The words worn out echoed in Ella's mind. Hannah hadn't sacrificed a piece of jewelry. She had sacrificed her very body for Ella. The reality of her mother's suffering made Ella's previous promise feel insufficient. It now felt like a desperate, non-negotiable mission. Hannah had to stay in the hospital for observation and stabilization. Ella's life immediately fractured into 3 separate, exhausting, and overlapping segments. The student, she had to stay focused. Her final exams and college applications were due. She couldn't afford to lose the scholarships that were her only ticket out. She crammed books into her oversized backpack, studying late into the night at the hospital waiting room, under the dim, flickering light of a single lamp. The worker, the small savings Hannah had were gone, and the medical bills, even with basic insurance, were stacking up. Ella had to find more work. She took on extra shifts washing dishes at the diner, delivering papers early in the morning, and tutoring younger kids in math. Sleep became a forgotten luxury, replaced by short, frantic naps on the bus. The caretaker, every evening, after classes and work, Ella would go to the hospital. She wouldn't just sit there. She cared for Hannah with an unwavering devotion. She fed her, carefully combing the tangles out of her hair and reading her favorite worn-out paperbacks aloud. She became the fierce advocate, politely but firmly demanding attention from the busy nursing staff. This triple life was relentless. There were days she felt dizzy from hunger and lack of sleep, days where the pressure of her exams felt like a physical weight on her chest. One late night, sitting in the hospital hallway trying to solve a complex coding problem, she felt the familiar burn of tears, and she put her head in her hands. The exhaustion was a heavy, suffocating blanket. She was scared she might collapse herself, or worse, that she might fail her exams and ruin everything. But then, she looked through the glass window into Hannah's room, seeing her mother's frail, sleeping form, and the image of the gold locket flashed in her mind. She thought of the cold roadside where she was abandoned. That memory was all the fuel she needed. She took a deep breath, wiped her eyes, and started coding again. She refused to break. A week later, Hannah was stable enough to receive visitors properly. She looked at Ella, her face etched with worry. "Ella, baby girl," Hannah whispered, her voice weak. "You look exhausted. You have to stop coming here so much. You can't ruin your studies for me. That scholarship is everything." Ella gently squeezed her mother's hand. "Mom, stop worrying about my studies. You are everything. Without you, there is no scholarship, no future." Hannah shook her head sadly. "I shouldn't have been so weak. I shouldn't have broken down. I've only made things harder for you." "No, Mom," Ella interrupted, her voice firm. "You didn't break down. You wore yourself out, loving me. You work yourself to exhaustion so I could have a chance. That is not weakness. That is the greatest strength I have ever known." That moment, standing by her mother's hospital bed, was the ultimate turning point. Ella didn't just reaffirm her old promise to repay Hannah. She made a fierce, profound new one. She leaned down, her eyes full of determined tears, and spoke the oath with absolute conviction, knowing that her technology and business acumen were the keys to making it real. "I swear, Mom," Ella vowed, her voice raw with emotion. "I will not stop. I will work until my fingers bleed. And one day soon, you will never, ever have to work again. You will never suffer another moment of pain or want in your life. Everything you did for me, I will do 10 times over for you. This is the last pain you will ever feel." It was a beautiful, fierce promise of justice and love conquering physical suffering. Ella's devotion was now a powerful, unstoppable force focused on the finish line. She left the hospital that night, not exhausted, but powered by a singular, life-defining purpose. She would work her miracle now, for the woman who first worked one for her. With Hannah stable but frail at home, Ella entered the final, most brutal phase of her long climb. She wasn't just fighting for grades anymore. She was fighting for the full-ride scholarship that was the key to fulfilling her sacred vow. Without it, college was a fantasy. The process was a gauntlet. Applications, essays, specialized subject exams, and interviews, each one demanding time, money, and focus that she barely had. She was working 3 different small jobs, studying calculus in the hospital waiting room, and caring for her mother. Yet, despite this impossible schedule, she attacked the scholarship applications with the same relentless focus she applied to her coding. She knew her raw talent was great, but her story, the sheer grit of a journey, was her most powerful asset. Poverty was her greatest enemy, and it showed up in small, vicious ways. Many of the scholarship exams and university interviews were held miles away, downtown, or in neighboring districts. Without bus fare, which she needed to save for Hannah's medicine, Ella had to rely on her own 2 feet. She often found herself walking miles in the early morning darkness or the late afternoon heat, sometimes with the rain soaking through the old tape on her shoes. She'd arrive at a testing center exhausted, sometimes damp, her concentration already halved by the physical strain. She would quickly use the bathroom mirror to straighten her hair and wipe the sweat from her face, hiding the evidence of her struggle before walking into the formal exam room. She couldn't let the fatigue or the blisters on her feet derail her. Every agonizing step was a small prayer, a silent reaffirmation of her promise. "This walk is nothing compared to what Mom did for me. I refuse to break." For all her incredible effort, the initial response was brutal. The rejection letters started arriving, thin, cold slips of paper in the mail. "We regret to inform you that the funds for the Arts and Sciences Scholarship have been allocated elsewhere. While your application was competitive, we feel you would not be the best fit for our program at this time." It was a relentless, soul-crushing wave. Each no was a heavy blow, not just to her ego, but to her hope. She would read the letters in the dim light of her apartment, her heart sinking. "They don't see the scores, Ella," Hannah murmured one night, frail but watching her daughter closely. "They see the address on the application." But Hannah, the ultimate survivor, quickly added the necessary context. "But you don't let it stop you, baby girl. You try again. You find a different path. You've survived worse than a letter." Ella wouldn't surrender. Each rejection was simply tossed into a box, and she would immediately fill out 3 more applications. Her resilience wasn't just defensive, it was offensive. She was a young woman who knew how to turn pain into pure, productive force. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her sheer, stubborn brilliance broke through. The application was for the highly competitive Vanguard Scholarship, a full-ride, merit-based award designed to find students with extraordinary potential who overcame severe socioeconomic obstacles. Ella poured her heart and soul into the essay, not hiding her story but using it as proof of her ability to fight and win. She earned an interview. This time, she walked 4 miles to the interview in her best, cleanest, though still slightly threadbare, dress. During the interview, she didn't just talk about her high GPA or her coding projects. She talked about the locket her mother sold. She talked about finding elegant solutions to complex problems, whether they were in a spreadsheet or in life. She presented herself not as a victim, but as a guaranteed investment. The wait afterward was the longest of her life. Then, the letter came. It wasn't thin and sterile. It was thick and official. Ella clutched it with trembling hands. Hannah, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, watched her eyes full of quiet anticipation. Ella slowly opened it and scanned the page, her heart hammering against her ribs. The words blurred, then snapped into focus. "We are delighted to inform you, full tuition, fees, and living expenses have been covered." Ella let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob, and dropped the letter. Hannah didn't even read it. She simply reached across the table and held Ella's hands, squeezing them tight. They didn't need to speak. The victory was deafening. Justice had finally arrived, delivered by the brilliant, determined effort of the young woman she had saved. This recognition, this moment of pure, earned triumph, is the emotional high point we're fighting for. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, faster and more powerfully than any rumor of poverty or shame. Ella got a full ride. "Did you hear? She's going to the best school. They said she's a genius." The news shocked everyone who had once doubted her. Mrs. Pearl was speechless, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly on her porch swing. Mr. Dennis stopped his truck, staring down the street where Ella used to walk miles in the rain. Tanya and her circle of mean girls fell silent, realizing the full, terrifying extent of the opportunity they had tried to destroy. Ella was no longer defined by her past. She was no longer the poor child mocked for her torn clothes. The full scholarship wasn't just money. It was the world's most prestigious validation, anointing her as a young woman rising into greatness. The contrast was staggering. The girl who had been abandoned and left to die on the roadside, the student whose dignity was ridiculed in the cafeteria, was now heading to a top university on a full scholarship to pursue her gift in technology and finance. Ella looked at Hannah, who was smiling, tears tracing paths through the wrinkles on her face. "You did it, baby girl," Hannah whispered. "You did it." The long, hard fight was over. Ella had refused to break, and in doing so, she had earned the victory that would change everything. Her greatness was not given, it was seized. And now, the true way, fulfilling the promise to Mom Hannah, was finally about to begin. The moment Ella walked across the graduation stage with a degree that validated her brilliance, she didn't pause. She didn't take a vacation. She took her fierce determination, her genius for financial systems, and her unyielding promise to her mother, and she immediately put them to work. Ella launched a small tech financial services company, a company focused on creating affordable, elegant software solutions for small businesses that, like Hannah, struggled to manage their money. She started in a tiny rented office space, running on the same cheap coffee and relentless hours that defined his student life. But this time, the struggle wasn't against poverty, it was against the competition. Her mind, honed by years of deprivation and constant study, proved to be unstoppable. She didn't just create good solutions, she created intuitive solutions. She saw the patterns and logic that others missed, and within a few short years, her small company exploded into a massive success. Ella's company didn't just succeed, it became an empire. Her solutions were revolutionary, and the demand quickly spread beyond the small city where she started. Soon, her financial tech was being used by companies in Toronto, servicing clients in London, and managing investments across the United States and the Caribbean islands. She became a major player in a world that once told her she was too poor, too young, and too wrong to ever enter. The girl who used to walk miles and patch shoes just to take an exam was now flying in private jets to meet global CEOs. The girl who was mocked for an empty lunchbox was now a millionaire, a leader, and a symbol of hope. But through every successful launch, every contract signed, and every million earned, Ella never forgot the quiet woman who made it all possible. The first, most important act of her new wealth was the fulfillment of her sacred vow. Her mother would never suffer again. Ella found a beautiful, small home, not a flashy mansion, but a safe, quiet, sunlit place in a lovely neighborhood with a garden where Hannah could finally rest. One afternoon, Ella took Hannah's hand and led her through the new, empty rooms. Hannah's eyes, usually clouded with quiet worry, were wide with disbelief. "Ella, baby," Hannah whispered, tears welling up. "This is too much. You didn't have to." Ella hugged her mother tightly, resting her cheek against Hannah's head. "I did have to, Mom. I promised you. Remember, you wore your body out for me. Now, you will never have to worry about a bill, a job, or a long walk in the rain again. This is your rest. Your suffering is over." Hannah, who was always so stoic, finally allowed the burden to fall away. She looked at her daughter, this magnificent, successful woman she had saved, and simply said, "My beautiful girl, my everything." The material comfort was wonderful, but the true healing was in the peace that finally settled over Hannah's exhausted spirit. Love had won, finally providing the justice of rest. Ella knew that her success wasn't just hers. It was a result of a miracle and a sacrifice. She never forgot the cold of the roadside, the sting of the cafeteria, or the desperation of the locket. Her true purpose, fueled by her upbringing, wasn't just to be wealthy. It was to lift others. Ella established the Hannah Foundation, named for the ultimate source of her inspiration. She poured millions of her own dollars into it, dedicating it to uplifting the same poor and marginalized communities she and Hannah came from. Ella wasn't just a philanthropist who wrote a check. She was actively building the ladder she had climbed. She made frequent, quiet trips back to her old neighborhood, talking to the young students, becoming a living, breathing symbol of what they could achieve. The scornful voices of the past, Mrs. Pearl, Mr. Dennis, and the jealous peers, were utterly silenced. Ella had not only risen, but she was lifting others with her. Her empire wasn't measured in revenue, but in the number of lives she helped rise from the shadows of poverty. The abandoned baby girl, who was told she was meant to die, had become a brilliant woman who now dedicated her life to ensuring that no other deserving child would ever be abandoned by opportunity. She had traded her pain for power and her wealth for lasting, community-wide justice. As she sat with Hannah in their beautiful, sunny home, watching her mother relax and finally enjoy life, Ella knew her work had just begun. The promise had been fulfilled completely. Love, fueled by determination and genius, had truly won. Years had flown by since Ella left that cracked pavement and stepped into her destiny. She had built her empire, secured her wealth, and kept her sacred promise to Mom Hannah, ensuring her mother was comfortable and cared for. She was a global name now, but there was one piece of unfinished business. She needed to close the door on the shame of the past, not by forgetting it, but by conquering it. This final, triumphant moment had to happen on the same ground where the ridicule began. The street where Hannah once found Ella was the same. Mrs. Pearl still held court on her worn porch swing. Mr. Dennis still tinkered with his truck across the road. They were older, more weathered, but their judgmental eyes remained sharp. They lived in the familiar routine of their small world. Then, the mundane quiet of the afternoon was shattered. First, there was the deep, unfamiliar rumble. Then, a line of sleek, luxury black sedans, vehicles that looked wildly out of place, turned the corner and glided slowly down the narrow, cracked road. They weren't just expensive. They carried an aura of power and importance. The neighbors rushed out of their houses and apartments, eyes wide with gossip and curiosity. Mrs. Pearl nearly fell off her swing, adjusting her spectacles. Mr. Dennis stopped his wrench mid-turn. The first car slowed and stopped right in front of the old apartment building, the one with the perpetually burnt-out porch light. A professional driver in a sharp suit quickly opened the back door. And then, she stepped out. It was Ella. She was instantly recognizable, yet utterly transformed. Her blonde hair, once tousled and thin, was styled with quiet elegance. Her clothes were a beautiful, perfectly tailored suit that spoke of effortless wealth, not expensive flashiness. She carried herself not with the timid silence of the ridiculed child, but with the composed, quiet power of a global CEO. Her eyes, though, were the same, clear, intelligent, and fiercely determined. The crowd went instantly silent. The sound of stunned realization was deafening. Mrs. Pearl felt her breath hitch in her throat. She recognized the girl whose shoes she had mocked, the girl she had called a burden. Mr. Dennis, frozen by his truck, saw the student he predicted would fail. They weren't looking at a former neighbor. They were looking at justice walking in flesh and blood. The shock was total. Ella barely glanced at the gathering crowd. She didn't have to announce her success. Her presence was the statement. She ignored the neighbors who, now recognizing her success, suddenly started to step forward, ready to smile and pretend they had always believed in her. Ella simply walked past them. Their judgment and their new, phony admiration were equally irrelevant. Her focus was fixed on one place. Standing on the worn steps of their old apartment building was Hannah. Ella had arranged for her to come back for this one sacred moment. Hannah was dressed simply but beautifully, no longer frail, but healthy and at peace. Tears were already streaming down her face, not of sorrow, but of profound, overwhelming victory. Ella's triumphant walk wasn't towards a crowd or a camera. It was towards her purpose. She reached the bottom of the steps. The assembled neighbors, the mockers, the doubters, the ones who threw the cruelest cuts, were now a silent, witnessing jury. Ella reached her mother. She didn't hug her right away. Instead, in the same spot where she had once walked away in shame from the betrayal, and where Hannah had defended her with dignity, Ella knelt. She knelt on the cracked pavement, bringing her powerful, successful self down to the level of the woman who sacrificed everything. She didn't care about the expensive fabric of her suit or the dirt of the street. "Mom," Ella said, her voice clear, strong, and thick with emotion, looking up into Hannah's tear-filled eyes. "I kept my promise. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are honored." Hannah could only nod, reaching down to stroke her daughter's face. "You gave me back my life, Ella. You gave me so much more." Ella stood up, taking her mother's hand. She turned to face the stunned crowd of neighbors, who stood silent, watching every single beat of this scene. This was the moment of ultimate justice, not revenge, but a declaration of truth. Ella looked across the familiar faces. Mrs. Pearl, eyes wide with regret. Mr. Dennis, his head bowed. She didn't look with anger, but with absolute certainty. Then, she delivered the final words of her story, the true meaning of her life, making a declaration that silenced the entire street in awe. "This is the woman who gave me life. She found me abandoned and dying on this very street, and she traded her last piece of gold, her health, and her comfort, just so I could eat and study. She is my strength. She is my heart. Every success I have built, every life my foundation touches, started with the love and the sacrifice of this one woman, Hannah. I am simply the reflection of her light." A complete, absolute silence fell over the street. The air, heavy with decades of scorn and ridicule, finally broke. There was no room for judgment, only a deep, collective at the sight of this extraordinary love story. The powerful, successful woman wasn't celebrating her own triumph. She was celebrating the unparalleled dignity and sacrifice of the poor woman who saved her. Hannah smiled at her daughter, a smile filled with pride and peace. Love had defeated poverty. Love had silenced cruelty. And love, in the end, had created an empire. The story of Ella's success was public knowledge. The full scholarship, the coding genius, the rapid growth of her global finance and technology empire. But the true, raw source of her relentless drive remained a secret, known only to a handful of people and the woman in the front row. This final chapter takes place on a grand stage, under the heat of lights, at the inaugural gala of the Hannah Foundation. Leaders, investors, philanthropists, and media from all over the world were packed into the massive auditorium. Ella, elegant and poised, walked to the podium, ready to announce the next phase of her foundation's work. Seated in the very first row, dressed beautifully and radiating quiet dignity, was Mom Hannah. This was her moment, too. Ella began her speech by talking about the Foundation's mission, creating opportunity, leveling the playing field. Then, she paused, looking directly at the camera, her clear, bright eyes locking with the millions watching at home. "Tonight, I want to talk about why we do this, Ella began, her voice calm but carrying the absolute weight of a past. And to do that, I have to share the truth of who I am. Ella took a deep breath and started at the beginning, detailing the scene with simple, stark language. She described the cold, the loneliness of the roadside, and the terrifying knowledge that she was hours, maybe minutes, from death. I was not a lucky baby, she stated. I was an abandoned baby, unwanted, left to die by someone who saw me as worthless. A gasp rippled through the audience. The silence in the auditorium became so intense you could practically hear the cameras whirring. The powerful, successful CEO of a massive tech company was telling the world she was found trash. Then, she transitioned to the heart of the story. She spoke of the poor black woman who stumbled upon her, the woman who had nothing, but who chose to spend her last ounce of strength, her last bit of food, and her very history, the gold locket, to save a life that wasn't hers. I'm not here today because I was found by money or by privilege, Ella declared, her voice rising slightly. I am here because a woman named Hannah chose me. She looked at a dying, white infant, and she saw a child. She chose to love me when no one else would. She chose to starve so I could eat. She chose to wear her body out so I could study. She recounted the mocking of the neighbors, the cold dismissal of the teachers, the pain of the betrayal, and the moment Hannah collapsed from exhaustion. It wasn't a sob story. It was a powerful testimony to Hannah's unwavering love. Ella's testimony shook the world to its core. The world was forced to confront the heroic nature of the woman it would normally overlook, the minimum wage worker, the woman struggling with bills. Hannah, the epitome of quiet sacrifice, was suddenly elevated to a global icon of motherhood and humanity. The shock came from the realization that Ella's massive wealth and success were not the end goal. They were simply the currency of her gratitude. Her entire empire was built on a debt of love she was now repaying to the world. Ella had conquered the past with her words, and now she cemented her legacy with her wealth. Turning back to the business of the night, Ella announced the largest initiative in the Foundation's history. My mother taught me that you don't fight for comfort, you fight for dignity and opportunity, Ella said, her voice ringing with conviction. I was saved by a miracle, but millions of children are lost because they lack basic dignity. We are going to change that. She announced a commitment of hundreds of millions of dollars, a staggering sum, dedicated to creating safety nets for poor and marginalized youth worldwide. Ella was building schools where teachers would believe, hospitals where the worn-out would be healed, and foundations where no child would ever have to go to an exam with a hungry stomach or a broken shoe. She was using her immense power to ensure that her childhood suffering would never happen again. Finally, Ella finished her speech and walked down the steps. The audience rose in a standing ovation that was louder than anything she had ever experienced. But she didn't stop to shake hands or accept accolades. She walked directly to the front row, reaching for Hannah. She pulled her mother gently to her feet, embracing her tightly, letting the roar of the crowd wash over them both. As the cameras flashed, capturing the powerful image of the elegant, wealthy woman and the humble, beloved mother, Ella bent down and whispered into Hannah's ear. It's done, Mom. The whole world knows your love. Hannah looked at her daughter, her eyes shining with peace. You did well, my light, she whispered back. You did more than repay me. Ella stood tall, holding Hannah's hand high for the world to see. Her testimony had done more than just shock the world. It had delivered global justice and proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that love is the most valuable, transformative force in existence. The poor woman who took in a dying child had created an empire of hope, and the young woman she saved had returned that love to the world, multiplied 1,000,000 times over. Hope, justice, and love had won, forever. The days following Ella's dramatic testimony at the Foundation Gala were a blur of media attention and surging stock prices. Her raw honesty had resonated globally, transforming her already successful empire into a moral powerhouse. Investors knew that a company driven by this kind of gratitude wasn't just profitable, it was unstoppable. The world was prepared for the news of Ella's next move, a massive acquisition, perhaps, or a new technological breakthrough. But they were not prepared for the final, most profound act of honor she had reserved for the woman who deserved it all. The setting for this final twist was the glittering, glass-walled boardroom of Ella's corporate headquarters. Around the polished mahogany table sat the company's board of directors, powerful lawyers, veteran investors, and financial strategists, all people who had never once known true hardship. They had gathered to discuss the next major step in governance, and they expected Ella to announce a former industry titan as the new chairperson of the board. This is Ella's moment to hand the world, symbolically, to the one person who earned it. Ella stood at the head of the table. She didn't use jargon or complicated finance terms. She spoke the language of her heart. "We have built a business dedicated to finding value where others see none," Ella began, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the boardroom. "We are driven by efficiency, foresight, and a profound respect for true human struggle. We understand that the greatest value often comes from the most overlooked places." The board nodded in agreement, waiting for the name of the industry giant. "For months, I've considered who best embodies the true soul and ethical compass of this company," Ella continued, her voice gaining a steely resonance. "Who understands the risk, the sacrifice, and the relentless dignity required to survive and thrive? Who sees the worth in a single dollar and the potential in a single life better than anyone else?" Then, she dropped the ultimate bombshell. Ella turned to the door, which opened to reveal Hannah, dressed in a beautiful, understated suit, walking into the most powerful room in the company. Effective immediately, Ella announced, her voice ringing with finality, "I'm installing the new chairwoman of the board for this entire empire." She walked over to Hannah, placing her hand on her mother's shoulder. "I proudly introduce her, my mother, Hannah." A stunned silence fell over the mahogany table. The most educated, moneyed people in the world were slack-jawed, looking at the simple, quiet woman whose highest education was the School of Hard Knocks, whose greatest degree was unconditional love. The shock was immediate, but Ella's conviction brooked no argument. She addressed the stunned board, explaining her choice with an unwavering logic that only a genius could deliver. "Hannah is the only person who has led a successful enterprise with no resources. She built a life from dust. She understands risk better than any investment banker here, because she risked her life for me. She is our moral compass. She will ensure that every decision we make upholds the dignity of our clients and the purpose of our foundation." And just like that, the final, glorious twist of justice was complete. The woman who had been mocked by her neighbors for being too poor to take in an abandoned child, the woman Mrs. Pearl called a fool wasting her energy, now sat at the highest seat of power, the chairwoman of a multimillion-dollar global corporation, advising investors and guiding the future of philanthropy. She didn't need an MBA or an executive title. Her life was a qualification. She sat there, beside her daughter, her presence a silent, undeniable rebuke to every moment of scorn and every cynical prediction. Hannah never became a traditional executive, but her presence was a constant, powerful reminder of the company's core mission. She used her position to ensure the Hannah Foundation always prioritized the most vulnerable, guiding the Lockett Fund with a personal knowledge of true need. Ella and Hannah's story, now complete, became a legend, a modern fairy tale where the rags didn't turn to riches, but where sacrifice was repaid with a throne. Years later, in a final television interview, Ella was asked to summarize her journey, her success, and the woman who was her co-pilot in business and life. Ella smiled, her eyes fixed on the camera, delivering the closing argument of her existence, words that echoed to millions around the world, closing the circle of the initial abandonment forever. "The world threw me away, but this woman picked me up, and that changed everything." The poor black woman who wept over a dying baby on a cold roadside had not just saved a life. She had created a legacy, an empire built on the foundation of her own relentless, unconditional love. And that, truly, changed everything. If this story touched your heart, like the video and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. Don't also forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss more inspirational and heartwarming stories like this one.